A lot of Jets fans feel very pessimistic about the team right now, and that is understandable. But believe it or not, there are a number of reasons to be optimistic about the future of the team. We're talking reasons for Jets optimism today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, February 17th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about reasons Jets fans should be optimistic as the calendar turns from 2024 to 2025. And I feel like this show is necessary to do because there's a lot of pessimism right now in the New York Jets fan base, and that's completely understandable. The Jets currently own the longest playoff drought, not just in the NFL, but in any of the four major North American professional sports leagues, and they are coming off just a tremendously disappointing season. A lot of Jets fans were expecting big things this year from this team, and the team ended up going 5-12, and it leads to us turning the page. Another new coaching staff and front office coming in, another new quarterback coming in, the end of the Aaron Rodgers era, and there are a lot of fans out there who wanted Rodgers to return. I was not among them, but I do feel like, despite everything I just said, there are some really positive signs for this franchise. And, I'm not going to mention a couple of things. I'm not going to mention the decision to move on from Rodgers, although I think it was a positive for the franchise. I think that, we can debate that a lot, and we probably will continue to debate that a lot in the days and weeks ahead. But I think there are other things to discuss. I'm also not going to discuss the new coaching staff and the new front office, even though I do think the odds are very high the Jets are going to have better coaching this year. I mean, everybody always says that when they have a first-year coach, because you fired a bad coach, you assume the new guy is going to come in and be better. That doesn't always work out, but based on what the Jets had last year, where they essentially weren't coached for 3/4 of the season after they fired Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich was pulled in all sorts of different directions. The Jets, it wasn't so much they had bad coaching. It almost felt like they had no coaching for much of last season. It stands to reason the Jets coaching is going to be better. But we're going to avoid those obvious topics because I think there are some other things that are worth discussing. And one of them is why this new Jets era is going to be different from other new Jets eras. And that's mainly due to what Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji are inheriting. And I think about when other regimes started with this team. So you think back to the way the roster looked in 2021 when Robert Saleh took over. There was really nothing. He inherited nothing. When Joe Douglas took over as GM in 2019, he really inherited nothing. I mean, there were a lot of people out there who said, oh, Mike McCagnon isn't as bad as people make him out to be. Well, the roster was awful. The roster had no pieces in 2019 when Joe Douglas took over. You think about the roster. John Idzik left Mike McCagnon in 2015. I mean, Idzik did a terrible job. Think about Mike Tannenbaum, who had a lot of success early in his tenure, but had a horrible last two seasons. He left John Idzik one of the worst rosters in the league. Things are different now. Say what you will about Joe Douglas, and I have said a lot about Joe Douglas. I don't think Joe Douglas was as good as he was made out to be. I think Joe Douglas was disappointing in a lot of ways. I don't think Joe Douglas was the next great GM that he was portrayed as by many in the media when the Jets hired him. But Joe Douglas left this team in a better shape than he found it. And Joe Douglas made some good moves. And those good moves put the Jets in a different place than they've been in the past when new people have taken over the team. Because you look at this roster's got a core of talent. And we can start by talking about a position where the Jets have really struggled to find difference makers, wide receiver. They've got a difference maker in Garrett Wilson. And look, what they have behind Garrett Wilson's not a lot, but starting from the point where you got a number one receiver is very different from where the Jets typically start with a new head coach and a new general manager. You can go down the line. We can talk about the entire 2022 draft class, a legitimate shutdown corner in Sauce Gardner, a very solid defensive end in Jermaine Johnson, and Breece Hall, who, for as much as he may be criticized, is still an above-average running back. You could talk about some of the guys the Jets drafted in 2021. We know they whiffed on Zach Wilson, but they did find some good players in that 2021 draft class. I mean, you look back on that, at the end of the day, that 2021 class, I guess it's tough to get over missing on the quarterback at number 2, but they kind of salvaged it. Elijah Vera Tucker's a very good guard. Jamian Sherwood, you hope he resigns, but he developed into an excellent linebacker, the team MVP this year. Michael Carter II, injury-plagued 2024, but top-notch slot corner before that. And there are other pieces to build around on this roster. I mean, you could talk about the Williams brothers, Quincy Williams, very good linebacker, Quinnen Williams, guy who, maybe not coming off his best season, but a guy who at his best has been a dominant defensive end. And there are other pieces. I mean, you could even to an extent talk about Will McDonald, who had a 10-sack season and was a good pass rusher. He's a guy who I think is part of the solution going forward. You could talk about Joe Tippmann, who's a solid center, a guy who looks like, a piece to build around on the offensive line. There's an actual base of talent. I think there's a huge disconnect right now in some portions of the fan base, because a lot of the people who were telling us that the Jets had Super Bowl talent before the season are now saying, well, this is a 3-win team. This is a 4-win team in 2025. And look, I'm not going to dive into the Rodgers debate, because if you're every day, or you know how I feel about that, and we'll continue to talk about Rodgers, some of his shortcomings this past season. But, if you felt like the Jets were a Super Bowl team heading into last season, you shouldn't feel like they're now a bottom of the league team just because they lost Aaron Rodgers. There is a base of talent. Now, what I would say is that people maybe went a little too overboard. Maybe people overrated the talent to a degree. Maybe it wasn't a Super Bowl roster, but now people have the pendulum's kind of swung too far in the other direction, where people are maybe selling the talent base a little short. Now, it's not enough to get to the Jets to the Super Bowl, and there will need to be additions made. And frankly, given the Jets' resources this offseason, it's probably going to take more than 1 year to get the Jets into a team that's got a legitimate chance to go to the Super Bowl, because there just isn't a lot of cap space this offseason, and the Jets don't have a surplus of draft picks. So there are holes to fill. But we are starting from a much better spot than we were in 2021 or 2019 or 2015 or 2013. You insert when the Jets had a new regime. Those were situations that were going to require deep, deep rebuilds. The current Jets do not. And anybody telling you the Jets, because they didn't bring back Aaron Rodgers, the Jets should sell off all their parts, I have a tough time buying into that, because for the first time in a really long time, it feels like the Jets actually have some pieces in place. They have pieces in place at some of the key positions. You want to talk about, the wide receiver position with Garrett Wilson. You want to talk about the corner position with Sauce Gardner and Michael Carter II. You want to talk about the defensive line. The guys I named, Jermaine and Quinnen, and even Will McDonald. This is the start of a really good roster. It's not quite there yet, but I think that there are pieces in place that can get this team to a good spot. And you have to remember that the difference between, a 6-7 win team and a 9-10 win team, it's not that great. I mean, I think the 2025 Jets to end up having a winning record, they'll need to have a little bit of luck, but luck plays a bigger role in the NFL than we want to believe. Some injury luck, some luck in some close games, maybe a schedule that pans out a little bit better than you might think on paper at this time of the year. Jets have a shot to be a pretty decent team. You add in what hopefully, I know I said I wouldn't say this, but you hopefully add in some good coaching. Jets might be better than people expect. And one reason is their base of talent. Another reason that we'll discuss as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets, the Jets actually are in pretty good shape at a critical spot where they have struggled to build for years. For the first time in a decade or so, there is a key spot on the field where you got to feel pretty good where the Jets are right now, and that could have major implications for whoever plays quarterback. We'll go into more detail on that continuing here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. And today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game. So even if you missed the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Of course, we're heading into the second half of the NBA season. We just finished the All-Star game, or whatever that monstrosity was. I mean, if you watched it, I don't know what that was supposed to be. Well, whether you're backing your team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, you'll never feel like you've missed your chance on FanDuel. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we're talking about the case for Jets optimism. We need a little bit of optimism in this fan base. It's been a tough run for Jets fans. This past year has probably been one of the most difficult years of any fan base, not just the Jets, have had to endure. And prior to that, well, the Jets have the longest playoff drought in the league and the longest playoff drought in any of the four major North American sports leagues. So fans are down. The Aaron Rodgers era began with great fanfare and completely fizzled out. So what's the case for Jets optimism? Well, in our first segment, we talked about how, this roster is not terrible, which is not something you can say often about the Jets over the last decade and a half. There are pieces to build around, and the task to build a good team is not as steep as it's been at many points in recent history for this franchise. But building on that, and we talked, this will overlap a little bit with what we talked about in the first segment. The Jets, for the first time in recent memory, and you may have to go back to the DeBrickashaw, Ferguson, Nick Mangold days to say this is a team that actually looks pretty good on the offensive line. It's not a complete offensive line yet. A couple things to figure out. Most notably, the Jets will need to figure out who's going to play right tackle for them in the 2025 season. Their 2024 right tackle, Morgan Moses, is a free agent. So look, the line is not complete right now, but it looks like you're bringing back four starters. And I'm going to include Olu Fashanu in that mix. Olu Fashanu was not the day one starter in 2024. He took over little over halfway through the season when Tyron Smith suffered a season-ending injury, but Olu Fashanu looked good down the stretch. John Simpson looked like a really good signing at the left guard position. Joe Douglas missed on a lot of moves he tried to make it on the offensive line, but one thing I think he got right was the John Simpson signing. That was one of Joe Douglas's best moves. Joe Tippmann looks like a keeper at the center position, looks like a guy who's going to hold that position down for this franchise for a long time. And then at right guard, Elijah Vera Tucker, the thing with AVT is we've always said, he's good when he plays. The operative phrase has been when he plays, because he struggled to stay on the field. Well, 2024, he stayed on the field and kind of put behind what were a bunch of freak injuries he had suffered in the previous two seasons. Now, another challenge is that this offensive line, admittedly, is better pass blocking than run blocking. It's a strong pass blocking unit. It was a weak run blocking unit in 2024. Now, I think it's fair to ask how much of that was on coaching. I know I said I was going to stay away from coaching, but I can't help myself when we talk about Jets offensive line coaching. Keith Carter is a guy who I don't have Keith Carter to criticize anymore because he's gone. But I still will probably criticize Keith Carter because I've spoken extensively the last 2 years about how little I like the coaching job he did. And I'll tell you, it's difficult to differentiate what's coaching and what are the issues with the players. But on Jets run plays, man, there were just a lot of times where it looked like guys were confused with their assignments. And that's one of the spots where I think you can draw a direct line to coaching. It felt like guys never really knew who they were supposed to block. And I think to an extent that contributed to the run blocking struggles. Now, you can make an argument. Maybe the Jets need to reshuffle some things a little bit to get some better run blockers in here. There might be some sort of reconfiguration in place. Part of this goes back to what should the Jets try and do at the right tackle position. And there are going to be a couple of options there. We're going to talk about that in more detail in the days and weeks ahead as we get closer to the beginning of the free agency period, which is just a couple of weeks away. But one positive is that, again, this is a good pass blocking line. And I think that's important because there's such little clarity at the quarterback position right now. And I talked late last week about how I don't think there are any good options. I think that the least bad option for the New York Jets, at least at this point, might be to try and find a reclamation project. We've seen it happen across the league. We've seen it with former Jets quarterbacks, Geno Smith and Sam Darnold. We've seen it with, in Tampa Bay to an extent with Baker Mayfield. Guys who struggle, guys who have real issues, young guys who are highly touted, who are maybe thrown into situations they aren't ready for. They get into the right, they get some experience. They learn how to read a defense. They get into the right situation. Suddenly they look solid. I mean, look, everybody was ready to give up on Jared Goff as recently as 4 years ago. At the point he was traded from the Rams to the Lions, he was viewed as a salary dump. He was viewed as a very undesirable quarterback. Goes to Detroit. They have a great pass blocking line. You put him in a good system. Suddenly Jared Goff's looking really good. Suddenly Jared Goff's capable of quarterbacking a team that gets the 1 seed in the NFC. Now the Jets don't have that caliber of offensive line. They're not the Detroit Lions right now. But nobody's saying they're the Detroit Lions. We're talking about reasons to be optimistic. And I think that one of the key components, if you're going to make it work with a quarterback who, is not a superstar, if you're going to try and make it work with a quarterback who's the type of guy who's, a middle of the pack type quarterback, somebody who as good as the sum of parts around him, somebody who may not be able to lift his team up, but somebody who, if you put him in the right situation, can succeed. This is actually the type of offensive line where I could see it working. Again, we got to figure out a few things. We got to figure out the right tackle position. That's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Do the Jets bring Moses back? Do they look to the draft? Do they look elsewhere? Well, that's a topic for another day. But it's been very rare in recent years that we've been able to say the Jets have 4 of their offensive line spots not only locked in, but looking pretty good. This time of year, we're usually trying to talk ourselves into a Jets offensive line. We're trying to talk ourselves into Laken Tomlinson's going to be better next year. We're trying to say, well, they'll draft somebody, even though sometimes they don't. We're trying to instead of talking about how Olu Fashanu looked really promising, we're trying to tell ourselves that guy, the late round pick last year, maybe he'll develop into a starter. It's a different feeling. There's a real feeling of confidence, and there should be a real feeling of confidence when discussing this offensive line in a way that just has not been the case in the past. The Jets have really struggled to figure out the trenches. With Mike McCagnon, it was because he never really addressed it. With Joe Douglas, it was because even though he tried to address it, he really did not make the right choices until his final season. And there was some bad luck. There was obviously bad injury luck with Mekhi Becton and Elijah Vera Tucker suffering so many injuries. But it's just different now. And when you can actually win in the trenches, when you can actually protect your quarterback, it creates opportunities that would not be there otherwise. And for the first time since maybe the DeBrickashaw, Ferguson, Nick Mangold days, there's a real sense, and there should be a real sense that the Jets can help a quarterback out. And, part of this will go back to hopefully they made the right offensive coordinator hire in Tanner Engstrand. Part of this will go to, the help that Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall can provide a quarterback. And hopefully Darren Muji makes some good signings. Hopefully Darren Muji adds some additional weapons on top of these guys. But the offensive line that this regime is inheriting is one of the best Jets offensive lines in some time. And, I'm not saying it's the greatest offensive line in the league, but by Jet standards, by recent Jet standards, we got something to work with here for the first time in a while. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue discussing reasons for Jets optimism. And while it's been a disappointing decade and a half for Jets fans, there's another reason. And all you have to do is look across the league. It's not as hard to turn it around quickly as you think. There are some things that can happen, and we'll discuss what they are as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday. We're talking about reasons for optimism among Jets fans. And look, Jets fans in some ways are the most optimistic bunch in the league. And a lot of people won't believe me saying that, but think about everything this fan base has been through. I mean, we could talk about the last 14 years where the team has struggled so much, where they haven't made the playoffs, where they've had one winning season in that stretch, 14 straight years of no playoffs and only one winning season there. So it's not like this team has, not like this team's been good and just, kind of fallen into a numbers game all that frequently. It's been a bad team for a really long time. But even before then, I mean, if you've been a fan for decades, you've been through an awful lot. But there's a reason you're still a fan. That's because you believe. And I think after going through all that, if you still believed, well, somewhere there's an optimist in you. And I think that there are a lot of positive signs for the New York Jets. And I think that this might be a good thing that people are so down on this team, because I think this is true. And this is something I've talked about a lot on the show the last couple of years. the Jets have been the biggest overpromised and underdelivered team in the league for some time. And for once, it feels like expectations are low. It feels like expectations are too low. And the Jets are finally in a position where they can underpromise and overdeliver. And I would not be surprised if the Jets left 2025 with a season that people come away with a positive feeling from. And that'd be a first in quite a while. It's really difficult to talk about the last Jets season anybody had a positive feeling about. I mean, was it 2022 where they improved their win total from 4-7 and were actually playing meaningful December games? Was it 2015 when they won 10 games and barely missed the playoffs because of the last game loss against the Buffalo Bills? Was it 2013 when people expected them to be the worst team in the league and they went 8-8? Was it 2010 when the last time they went to the playoffs? It's difficult to say, but I think that there's a good chance that Jets fans will feel positive about this season. And I think when you've been as bad for as long as the Jets, you get it into your head that it's impossible to turn things around. I think you get it into your head that, you need 5 years to turn things around. You're seeing a little bit of that with the fan base. I mean, some people are saying, well, the Rodgers thing failed, so now let's just trade everybody off and rebuild and reset. And it's not really necessary. And all you need to do is look at some of the other teams that have had quick turnarounds. I mean, who thought Washington was going to be good this year? Washington almost made the Super Bowl. They went to the NFC Championship game. The one thing Washington did that we can't do is Washington got rid of their terrible owner. So that is the one thing the Jets haven't done this offseason. The Jets won't be able to do this offseason that Washington did. But Washington was every bit as big of a mess. They were probably a bigger mess a year ago than the Jets were at this time. They didn't have a quarterback. They didn't have a head coach. They brought in Dan Quinn to try and right the ship. They brought in a new GM, and 12 months later, everything's different. But a team that I think is actually a better parallel is the Denver Broncos, who are coached by Aaron Glenn's mentor, Sean Payton, because I think a lot of people wrote the Broncos off when they got rid of Russell Wilson. I would imagine that in the Broncos fan base a year ago when they got rid of Russell Wilson, there were probably a lot of people saying the same stuff that Jets fans are saying about the team losing Aaron Rodgers right now. I bet a lot of people said, well, we throw away our experienced quarterback. We don't have a quarterback in place. We're heading for another reset, another rebuild. It's going to take forever for us to make the playoffs. You have to remember, heading into this season, the Broncos had the second longest playoff drought in the league. The Jets were the only team that had a longer playoff drought than the Broncos. What happened? Broncos hit on the right quarterback in the draft. And the Broncos made the playoffs for the first time since 2015. And now things feel good around the Broncos franchise. Now, of course, there are differences. Jets, I'm skeptical the Jets are going to draft a quarterback this year. I'm skeptical that there's someone good enough for the Jets drafted early this year, whereas the perception was last year that was a very deep class at the quarterback position. Aaron Glenn obviously is not the proven coach Sean Payton is. Sean Payton has a Super Bowl win on his resume. Aaron Glenn's a first-time head coach. I'm not saying that, just because things went this way with Washington or because things went this way with Denver, that they will automatically go the same way with the New York Jets. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily follow. But the point that you should take away is that just because a team is bad for a long time doesn't necessarily mean it's doomed to be bad forever. And frequently in the NFL, we overestimate how long it takes for a team to turn things around. If you look at predictions before the season, typically the pundits are just kind of like slightly changing the previous year's record. And in reality, a lot changes from year to year in the NFL. In any given year, about half the playoff teams are different from the previous season. So, yes, Jets fans have earned the right for skepticism. There is no question about that. It has been a painful, painful, painful time to be a New York Jets fan. Every time you've tried to get your hopes up with this team, they have let you down. I don't deny that. In fact, I feel like in the now 8.5 years we've done this podcast, I've said over and over, we're right around the corner from maybe changing it. It can change quickly, and it hasn't changed yet for this franchise. But that does not mean things are incapable of turning around. And it does not mean things are incapable of turning around quickly. You see it happen. I know you haven't seen it with the Jets, but you see it happen all the time in this league, that teams are able to have rapid turnarounds. And the key point is getting the right people in place. And, you have to hope that, I know I said I wouldn't talk about the coaching staff, but you hope that they hired the right people, because if they did, that can make all the difference in the world. And we could be talking about a very different Jets team. We could be feeling very different about this team very quickly. Let's hope we do. But anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Monday, everybody, and we'll be back tomorrow for our Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets.